in the high country of an old kingdom, where the long green hills fold into one another in slow, patient waves, and the wind moves down from the moors above with a sound that the people of the lower valleys have, in the long unwritten history of the country, learned not to listen to too closely. There is a small chapel on a hillside. The chapel is not large. It is perhaps 15 paces long and 7 paces wide. It is built of the local stone, which is a pale grey that goes to almost silver in the long blue light of dusk, and the roof is slate that has been replaced, in the long years of the chapel standing, perhaps 20 times, in the careful, unhurried way that very old buildings are tended in country places, where there is no other building like them. The chapel has a single door of old oak, which has been hung on its hinges for longer than anyone in the surrounding country has been keeping records. The door has, on its outer face, a small iron ring for a handle and a small carved cross above the ring, and below the cross a second carving that is not a cross, that is older than the cross, that the people of the surrounding country do not look at directly when they pass the door, and that they have not, in any of the centuries the chapel has been standing, asked any of the keepers of the chapel about. The chapel stands on a small flat shoulder of the hillside, perhaps halfway up the slope, above a small village called Pen Llwyd. The shoulder is reached by a narrow grass track that runs up from the village past the lower fields, through a small wood of stunted hawthorn, and out onto the open hillside above. The chapel is the only building on that part of the hill. There are no houses near it. There is no graveyard around it, although there is a single low stone wall that encloses a small patch of grass, perhaps 30 paces across, in which the chapel stands. There are no trees within the enclosure. There is no flower or shrub. The patch of grass within the wall is kept short by a small flock of 3 sheep that belong to the keeper, and that are moved up to the chapel and back down to the village by the keeper twice a year, in the spring when the upper grass first comes in, and in the autumn when the upper grass is finally going. The sheep, by long custom, are never sold. They are not bred. When one of the 3 dies, the keeper acquires a new one from the village's flock, and the new one is brought up the track in a small wooden cart, and the new one stays with the other 2, and the 3 become the chapel's flock again, until one of them dies, and the cycle begins again. There has always been a flock of 3. There will always be a flock of 3. The villagers of Pen Llwyd do not know why there are 3. They know only that the keeper requires 3, and that this requirement is not negotiable, and that they will provide a 4th if she ever asks, and that she will, by every account that has been kept, never ask. Inside the chapel, on the western wall, opposite the door, there is a tomb. The tomb is a single block of dark slate, about the length of a man and the height of a man's chest, set into a shallow recess in the wall. The slate is darker than any of the other stone in the chapel. It is the kind of dark slate that is quarried in this country, only from a particular cleft in the high moor above Pen Llwyd, and that has been quarried from that cleft, in small careful quantities, for more than 1,000 years. The slate is cold to the touch in summer. It is colder still in winter. It is, by every account that has ever been given of it by the keepers who have sat with it through long nights, never quite the same temperature as the air in the chapel, no matter what the weather outside has done. There is no inscription on the slate. There is no name carved on it. There is no date. There is only, at the very center of the upper face of the slate, a small smooth depression, perhaps the size of a hand, that is worn into the dark stone by something that has been laid against it, very gently, every night for a very long time. What has been laid against it has been laid against it by the keepers. The keepers are, at any given time, one person. The person is always a woman. There has been, in the long unwritten history of the chapel, no exception to this. The reasons for the rule have not been written down. The keepers themselves have, when asked, said only that the rule is older than they are, and that they do not question it, and that they do not advise others to question it. The villagers of Pen Llwyd, who have lived alongside the keeping for as long as any of them have been keeping records, do not know exactly when the chapel was built. The oldest of the village documents, which are kept in a small wooden chest in the back room of the village church, mention the chapel by name in entries that are dated to the 14th century. The chapel is referred to in these entries as if it were already old at the time, and as if its custom was already established and known. There are no entries in the village documents that describe the building of the chapel. There are no entries that name the first keeper. There are not even entries that explain what the chapel is for. The custom of the chapel was, in the 14th century, as in every century since, a thing that was not written down. It was a thing that was known. It was a thing that was passed, from one generation of village women to the next, in the small quiet conversations that women have with their daughters, and their nieces, and their granddaughters in the kitchens, and the doorways of small village houses, in the long evenings of all the long centuries that have, very slowly and very carefully, made the village what it is. The keeper, in the late autumn of the year that this story takes place, was a woman named Carys Wynne. She was 68 years old. She had been the keeper of the chapel of Pen Llwyd for 31 of those years. She had become the keeper in her 37th year, when the previous keeper, an old woman named Pen Llwyd, had finally become too frail to walk the grass track up to the chapel each evening and had passed the duty on. Carys had been chosen by Llwyd in the way that the keepers had always been chosen by their predecessors. The choice had been quiet. There had been no formal announcement. Carys had been told, on a particular afternoon in the spring of her 36th year, that she would be the next keeper, and Llwyd had begun to teach her the particulars of the keeping in the months that followed, and at the end of that summer, Llwyd had walked up the grass track with Carys for the last time, and had sat with her in the chapel through one whole night. And at the dawn of the following morning, Llwyd had given Carys the small iron key that had been hanging from the same iron ring inside the door for as long as the chapel had been standing, and had walked back down the grass track to her own small house in the village, and had not, for the rest of her life, climbed the track to the chapel again. Carys had walked up the track every evening since. 31 years, 11,315 evenings by any honest count, and she had counted them, in the long, careful way of women who keep duties that do not allow for absence. There had been 3 evenings in those 31 years when she had been ill enough that another woman from the village had had to walk up in her place. The first time it had been Llwyd herself, the year before Llwyd's death, who had risen from her own sick and walked the track in Carys's stead, and had not, for the next 2 days, recovered from the effort. The second time it had been Carys's own daughter, Mare, who had been 16 at the time, and who had walked up alone and sat through the night and walked back down at dawn in silence, and who had not, in all the years since, ever spoken of what she had seen or heard during her single night in the chapel. The third time it had been Llwyd's granddaughter, who lived in the next village over, who had been sent for in haste when Carys had broken her ankle on the track in winter, and who had come without complaint and sat the night and gone home in the morning and refused, when Carys had tried to thank her, to accept any thanks at all. Apart from those 3 nights, Carys had been the keeper. She had walked up the track at the proper hour each evening. She had unlocked the door with the small iron key. She had gone inside. She had lit the single beeswax candle that was always kept on the small wooden shelf beside the tomb. She had sat down on the low wooden stool that had been the keeper's stool for longer than any of the keepers had known. She had drawn from the small canvas bag. She carried the small bundle of items that the keepers always brought with them: a folded blanket, a small leather-bound book, a small wooden bowl, a small iron knife, and a single fresh sprig of rosemary that she had cut from her own garden that morning. She had laid the sprig of rosemary, very gently, against the small, smooth depression in the upper face of the dark slate. She had sat through the night. She had risen at the first grey light of dawn. She had taken the rosemary, which by then was no longer rosemary in any way that Carys understood, and she had placed it in the small wooden bowl, and she had carried the bowl out of the chapel, and she had, at the small flat stone at the edge of the enclosure, performed the small ceremony that the keepers had always performed at that stone at dawn, and that Carys would not, in this account, describe. Then she had walked back down the track to the village, and gone home, and slept, and risen in the afternoon, and prepared a fresh sprig of rosemary, and walked up the track again at dusk, and done the keeping again. 11,315 evenings. I want to spend a little time before continuing this story on what those evenings were like. Not the evenings that were difficult. There were not many of those, and most of them passed quickly, but the ordinary evenings, the long, unbroken thread of nights that made up most of the keeping. Because the keeping was, for the most part, not what an outsider might imagine. It was not constant terror. It was not constant struggle. It was, in its long, honest reality, mostly a quiet thing, the way that the most important quiet things in human life are mostly quiet things. And what the keepers had learned, over the long generations, was how to be quiet beside something that wished, very gently and very steadily, to be opened. Carys would walk up the track at the proper hour. She would unlock the door. She would go inside. The chapel in the dusk smelled always of cold stone and the slow blue sweetness of beeswax, and underneath those, very faintly, of something else that was older than the stone or the wax, and that did not have a name. She would light the candle. The candle would catch on the third or fourth strike of the small iron flint that hung from the wall beside the candle shelf. The flint had been used, by the candle shelf, for so long that there was a small worn hollow in the stone where the head of the flint had struck again and again over many centuries. The candle, once lit, would burn very slowly. It was made of beeswax that the keepers themselves prepared in the long afternoons of summer from the hives the keepers had kept in their own gardens for as long as there had been keepers. A single candle would burn from dusk until dawn. A second candle was always laid ready on the shelf, but the second candle had not been used in any of the records the keepers kept in the past 400 years. Carys would sit on the keeper's stool. The stool was small and low. It had no back. It had been worn by the seats of the keepers into a small shallow saddle in its top surface, the way that very old wooden seats are sometimes worn. She would arrange the folded blanket on her lap. She would open the small leather-bound book, which was not a Bible, and which was not, in any conventional sense, a book of prayers, but which had been kept by the chapel for as long as the chapel had been standing, and which contained, in handwriting that changed slightly from one keeper to the next over the long centuries, the small particular things that each keeper had chosen to write down, and she would read a few pages of it. She would read slowly. She had read the book through, in the long evenings of her keeping, more than 30 times. She no longer needed to read it for content. She read it now, in the way that one reads a thing one has known for many years, in the small steady way that the reading itself was a kind of company. She would set the book aside. She would lay the fresh sprig of rosemary against the small, smooth depression on the upper face of the dark slate. The rosemary, when she laid it there, was always living rosemary, cut from her own garden that morning, with the small green needles still soft, and the small purple flowers in their season, still bright. She would lay it gently. She would not press it. The pressing was not the keeping was the laying. The slate, in turn, would receive the rosemary in the way that slate receives things, quietly, without sign, without sound, and the keeping would have begun. She would sit. The hours would pass. The candle would burn. The wind, sometimes, would move outside the small chapel, around the upper corners of the slate roof, in the way that the wind moves around the roofs of small old buildings on hillsides. There would be, on some nights, a small, steady drumming of rain. There would be, on other nights, the deep silence of a frost evening, in which no sound moved at all on the hillside, and in which Carys could hear, very faintly, the small quiet shifting of the candle flame on its wick. She would not sleep. The keepers did not sleep. They sat through the night with the keeping. The keeping did not require speech. It did not require gesture. It required, in the small careful word that the keepers themselves used, presence, the simple, steady presence of one woman of the village, sitting beside the dark slate in the candlelight for the whole length of the night, so that the dark slate was not, on that night, alone. And the dark slate, in the company of the keeper, did not open. That was all. That was the whole of the keeping. The slate by itself, on a night without a keeper, would do what the slate wished to do. The slate with a keeper did not do it. The thing that wished to come up out of the slate stayed in the slate on the nights that the keepers sat, and the thing that the village did not have to think about during the day, because the keepers had thought about it during the night, stayed where it had been put, and the village continued. There were small variations from night to night. Some nights were heavier than others. The keepers had a private vocabulary for the nights, which was not written in the leather-bound book, but which was passed, like everything else, from one keeper to the next, in the long, quiet conversations of the teaching. There were quiet nights, on which the slate seemed almost to be sleeping, and on which the keeper would feel, in the long hours, almost as if she were sitting in an ordinary small chapel at night. There were heavy nights, on which the slate seemed more wakeful, and on which the keeper would feel, in the hours around midnight, a small steady pressure in the chapel that was not exactly the slate, and was not exactly herself, but was the small attentive interest of the slate in the keeper's presence. There were difficult nights, which came perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, on which the slate seemed more than wakeful, on which the candle would gutter without there being any draught, and on which the keeper would understand, with the particular clarity that the keepers understood such things, that the night was a night on which the keeping was actually being done. That on this night, in the absence of the keeper, the slate would have opened, and that her presence was what was preventing it. And there were, perhaps once in a generation, the nights that the keepers called the long nights. The long nights were the nights on which the slate was, for reasons that the keepers did not understand, particularly hungry. There had been, in Carys's 31 years of keeping, 4 long nights. They had been spaced unpredictably. The first had come in her 9th year of keeping, the second in her 17th, the third in her 24th. The fourth had come the previous winter. On a long night, the keeper did not, in any conventional sense, sit. She knelt. She knelt for the whole length of the night, beside the slate, with both hands pressed against the cold dark stone, and she said, aloud and steadily, the words that the leather-bound book contained for such nights, and that the keepers had said, in their turn, on every long night since the keeping began. She would say the words for hours. She would say them until her voice failed, and then she would say them with a voice that was no longer her own ordinary voice, and the slate would, very slowly, in response to her saying, settle. The long nights were the nights on which the keeper went home in the morning and slept for 2 days. They were the nights that the keeper did not, afterwards, talk about, even with the previous keeper, even with the keeper who came after her. Carys had, in the long, careful course of her 31 years, learned to read the nights. She had learned which ones would be quiet, and which ones would be heavy, and which ones would be the difficult 4s and 5s a year. She had learned, with some dread, to recognize the long nights when they came on. She had carried, in the long evenings of the keeping, the slow accumulating weight of what it meant to be the only person in the village who was paying attention to a thing that the rest of the village had agreed, by long ancient custom, not to look at. She had carried the weight without complaint. She had not, in any of her 31 years, ever told anyone in the village what the keeping actually felt like to the woman doing it. She had not told her daughter Mare. She had not told her late husband, who had died 11 years before, and who had, for the whole of their marriage, simply known that his wife went up to the chapel every evening and come back every morning, and had known not to ask, and had, on the difficult nights, kept a small candle burning in the kitchen window of their house until she came home. The villagers of Pen Llwyd had, in the long years of Carys's keeping, developed the same patterns of behavior toward her that the villagers of every previous generation had developed toward each successive keeper. They greeted her in the morning when they passed her in the village. They allowed her to make her small daily purchases at the village shop without comment. They did not, in any conversation, mention the chapel. They did not, in any conversation, ask her about it. They did not, in any conversation, even allude to it. The keeping was, in the way that small village customs sometimes are, a thing that was simply not discussed. Children of the village were taught, almost from the moment they could walk on their own, that the chapel was forbidden. They were not told why. They were told, in the simple, direct language that children's safety warnings often use, that the chapel was a place that bad things would happen to them if they entered, that the door was not for them, that if they ever found themselves on the grass track that led up to the chapel, especially after dusk, they were to turn around and go back down the track without looking up at the chapel itself. The children of the village absorbed this lesson with the seriousness that small children absorb the warnings of their adult world. They did not enter the chapel. They did not look at it for too long when they passed near the lower end of the track. They grew up understanding that there were some places that were not for ordinary people, that the village had elders who handled the things that needed to be handled in those places, and that the appropriate response of an ordinary villager to the chapel of Pen Llwyd was simply to stay away from it. The village records, which are kept in the small wooden chest in the back room of the village church, contain 3 entries that bear directly on the question of what the keeping is for. The entries are not in any of the church's official registers. They are in a small separate book of plain calfskin that is kept at the bottom of the chest under all the other documents, and that has been kept there since the chest was made. The book contains the dates of those events in the long history of the village, when there was no keeper, and the things that came to the village during those gaps. There are 3 entries. They are very brief. The book is not, in any of the traditions of the village, brought out of the chest and read aloud. It is consulted, when it is consulted at all, by the keeper in the early years of her keeping, in the company of the previous keeper, as a part of the teaching. The first entry refers to a year in the early 13th century, when the previous keeper had died suddenly of a fever and no successor had yet been chosen. The gap in the keeping had lasted 11 days. The entry, in the careful brief script of a parish clerk of that time, records that during those 11 days, 3 children of the village had vanished, that the cattle in the lower fields had been found in the mornings standing in postures that the cattle did not naturally take, and that an old woman who lived alone in a small house at the upper end of the village had been heard, on the 8th night, speaking through her open window in a language that no one in the village recognized, in a voice that was not her own. A new keeper had been hastily chosen on the 12th day. The keeping had resumed. The disturbances had stopped. The cattle had returned to their natural postures. The old woman had recovered her senses and had not, for the rest of her life, remembered what she had spoken or who had spoken through her. The second entry refers to a gap of 19 days in the early 16th century. The previous keeper had been a woman of strong opinions who had, in the late stages of her keeping, become convinced that the duty was a superstition and had refused to choose a successor. The village had, after some discussion, allowed her to make this choice, and the keeping had ended at her death. During the 19 days that followed, the records record that 2 villagers had taken their own lives, that the chapel door had been heard, on 3 separate nights, to open and close on its own from the village below, and that a young man of the village had walked up the grass track at dusk on the 18th day, against the warnings of his family, and had not come back down. A new keeper had been chosen on the 20th day. The keeping had resumed. The disturbances had stopped. The young man's body was never found. The keeper who was chosen on the 20th day had served for 43 years, and had been one of the village's most determined keepers, and had, in her old age, instituted the small careful tradition by which the next keeper is now chosen. The tradition by which the keeper, in her late years, identifies the woman she has come to believe will be the right one, and calls on her, alone, on a particular afternoon, with the small iron key in her pocket, and asks the question. The third entry refers to a gap of only 4 days, in the late 19th century. The previous keeper had died unexpectedly of a stroke, before she had been able to choose a successor. The village had moved with unusual speed in those 4 days, because the village had understood, in the way that villages understand the lessons their long histories have taught them, that the gap could not be allowed to go on. A new keeper had been chosen on the 5th day by the village's older women in a quiet meeting in the back room of the church. The keeping had resumed. The records record only one disturbance during those 4 days, which was that, on the third night, a low, steady humming had been heard coming from the direction of the chapel, audible throughout the village, and had continued for several hours, and had stopped, very abruptly, around the hour that would have been the proper hour of dawn. No one in the village had walked up the track during those 4 days. The keeper who was chosen on the 5th day had taken up the duty in great haste, with very little teaching, and had served for 38 years, and had been the keeper who had, in her old age, taught the keeping to Pen Llwyd, who had, in her own old age, taught the keeping to Carys Wynne. The records of the third gap end with a line, in the handwriting of the parish clerk of that time, which has never been officially explained, and which the village's older women, when they have read it in the course of teaching the next keeper, have always read in silence. The line says, "It is closer than we thought." Carys had read this line in her own teaching with Branwen and had asked Branwen what it meant. Branwen had been silent for a long time. Then Branwen had said, "It means what it says, Carys. The slate is closer than we think it is. The keeping is closer than we think it is. The whole of it is closer. We do not, in our daylight understanding, give the closeness its proper weight. The keeping is what gives the closeness its proper weight. That is what the keeping does. That is what we do." Carys had not, in the long years of her own keeping, ever forgotten this answer. This was the situation of Pen Llwyd and its chapel in the late autumn of the year that the village's understanding of its own custom was, for the first time in many generations, briefly disturbed. The disturbance began with the arrival, in the village, of a young woman from the larger world. Her name was Alwyn Morgan. She was 24 years old. She had been born in a town in the lowland country, some distance from Pen Llwyd, but her father's family had come from the village, and she had spent every childhood summer of her life staying with her paternal grandmother in the small stone house at the lower end of the village. Her grandmother had died in the previous spring. Alwyn had inherited, through her father, a small share of the stone house, which the family now intended to keep as a holiday property. Alwyn had come to the village, in the late autumn of that year, in order to spend several weeks setting the house in order after her grandmother's death. There were possessions to be sorted. There were small repairs to be made. There were the kind of practical tasks that the death of the last living occupant of an old house typically produces. Alwyn, who had recently completed her training as a librarian in one of the lowland towns, and who had been given a few weeks' leave by her employer to handle the family matter, had volunteered to come and spend the time that the work would require. She arrived in Pen Llwyd on a quiet afternoon in early November. She came up the long, winding road from the lowland country in a small car. She descended the steep final approach into the village in the late afternoon. She parked the car in the small space behind her grandmother's house. She carried her bags inside. She opened the windows to let the hill air into the rooms that had been closed for several months. She made herself a small meal from the provisions she had brought from the larger town. She went to bed early, as the long drive had tired her, and she intended to begin her work the following morning. She woke, in the early morning of her second day, to the soft grey light of a hill country dawn coming through the small window of the bedroom that had been hers during her summer visits as a child. She lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the wind moving down from the moor above, which was, in the deep quiet of the early morning, the only sound the village produced at that hour. She got up. She made tea in the small kitchen. She went out into the village. She walked in the cool air of the morning, the familiar paths of her childhood. She went to the small village shop, which had not yet opened. She went to the small stone bridge that crossed the stream at the center of the village. She went up to the wall above the lower fields, where the grass track began. The grass track ran up the hillside in front of her, past the lower fields, into the small wood of stunted hawthorn, and out onto the open hillside above. Alwyn, standing at the lower end of the track in the cool grey morning, found herself, for the first time in her life, looking up the track with the active attention of an adult. rather than the dim, half-warned attention of a child. She remembered, in the way that one suddenly remembers small things that have been waiting in a corner of the mind for many years, the warnings she had been given as a child. She remembered her grandmother, on a summer evening many years before, leading her firmly back down toward the village by the hand when she had wandered toward the lower end of the track. She remembered her grandmother saying, in the careful voice that adults used for warnings they did not want to elaborate on, that there were places in the village that were for the village elders, and that the track was one of them, and that Alwyn was not to walk it. She remembered also the old woman. She had seen the old woman often, in her summers as a child, walking up the track at dusk. The old woman had been small and grey-haired, and had carried a small canvas bag. She had walked up the track every evening of every summer that Alwyn had spent in the village. Alwyn had not, in any of those summers, ever seen the old woman do anything else with her evenings. She had walked up the track at dusk. She had come back down the track at dawn. She had been, in the structure of Alwyn's childhood understanding, simply one of the strange particular features of the village. Alwyn had not thought about the old woman for many years. Standing at the lower end of the track now, in the cool grey morning of her second day in the village, she found herself wondering for the first time what the old woman had been doing up the track all those nights. She did not, that morning, walk the track. She turned around. She went back down to her grandmother's house. She began the work she had come to the village to do, but the question stayed with her. Over the next several days, as she worked through her grandmother's possessions in the small stone house, Alwyn found herself returning, in small idle moments, to the question of the old woman and the track. She would stop, in the middle of folding a dress to be given to the village charity. She would set down a book she was sorting. She would stand at the kitchen window and look up the hillside toward the chapel that she had now, with adult eyes, identified as the destination of the track. She mentioned it, on the third evening, to one of her grandmother's old friends, a woman named Megan Edwards, who had come over to help with the sorting and who had stayed for a small supper. Megan was perhaps 70 years old. She had been Alwyn's grandmother's closest friend in the village for many decades. She was a sensible, kind woman with a quiet, competent manner, and she sat at Alwyn's grandmother's kitchen table that evening with a cup of tea in her hands, and listened patiently as Alwyn described, in the small, uncertain way of a young woman who is asking a question she is not entirely sure she should be asking, what she remembered of the old woman who had walked the track. When Alwyn had finished, Megan was quiet for a moment. She set her teacup down on the table. She looked at Alwyn with an expression that was neither surprised nor uncomfortable, but that contained a small, careful quality that Alwyn had not seen on Megan's face before. "That would have been Branwen, in your childhood," Megan said. "Branwen Llwyd. She passed away a long time ago now. She walked up to the chapel. She did. Every night. For how long? For most of her adult life, 51 years by the time she stopped." Alwyn looked at Megan across the table. Megan looked back at Alwyn with the same careful expression. "What was she doing up there?" Alwyn said. Megan was silent for a long moment. "She was the keeper," Megan said. "The keeper of what?" "Of the chapel." "What does that mean?" Megan picked up her teacup. She took a small sip of it. She set it down again. "It means she sat with it through the night," Megan said. "Every night, from dusk to dawn, so that other people did not have to." "With the chapel." "With what is in the chapel?" There was a small silence. Megan did not look uncomfortable. She did not look as if she was about to refuse the conversation. She looked simply as if she was choosing her words with the care of a woman who had been thinking about how she would have this conversation with one young person or another for a very long time, and who had decided at some point in the past what she would say when the moment came. "There has always been a keeper of the chapel of Pen Llwyd," Megan said. "There has always been one. There is always one. There will always be one, as long as the chapel stands. The keeper sits with the chapel through the night. The keeper does what is needed. The keeper does not, in the morning, speak about what was done. The village does not ask. The village does not, by the long custom of the village, even mention the keeping. We greet the keeper in the village. We sell her bread at the shop. We do not, in any conversation, refer to what she does at night, because the keeping is not a thing for daylight conversation, and because the keeper, whoever she is in any given generation, has chosen the duty and is bearing it for us, and the appropriate response of the rest of the village is to leave her alone to bear it. Alwyn looked at Megan in the warm, small light of the kitchen. "And the current keeper," she said. "Carys Wynne," Megan said. "You have probably seen her in the village without knowing who she was. And she walks up the track every night. Every night. What is in the chapel that needs to be sat with?" Megan looked at Alwyn for a long moment. "That," Megan said, "is the question that the village does not ask and that the keepers do not answer. I will tell you what I have been told by my own grandmother, and you may take it as you find it." She paused. She seemed to be gathering herself. Alwyn waited. "There is a tomb in the chapel," Megan said. "There is no name on it. There is no inscription on it. The chapel was built around it, perhaps 1,000 years ago, perhaps longer. No one knows who built it. No one knows who is buried in it. What is known is that the tomb wishes, on certain nights, to be opened, and that if it is allowed to open itself, the village does not know what would come out, but the village knows that it would not be good. And so the keeper sits with the tomb through every night, with a small fresh sprig of rosemary laid against the stone, and she keeps the tomb company, and the tomb, in the company of the keeper, does not open. And in the morning the keeper takes the rosemary, which has changed in the night, in a way that the keepers do not describe, and she does what the rosemary now requires to be done with it, which is also a thing the keepers do not describe, and she goes home, and the tomb is at peace for one more day." Alwyn sat very still in the small, warm kitchen, and this has been going on for 1,000 years. "For at least 1,000 years, Megan said. "Perhaps longer. The chapel is older than any of the records. The tomb is older than the chapel. What happens if no one is the keeper? It has happened in the long years that there has been a gap. Not often. 3 times in the records the village does keep. Each time in those years, things came to the village from the chapel that should not have come, and the village suffered, and a new keeper was found, and the keeping resumed, and the things that had come did not come again. The people of Pen Llwyd remember those years. We do not write them down, except in one small book that is not for ordinary reading. We tell our daughters about them when our daughters are old enough to be told. Branwen was the keeper before Carys. Branwen was the keeper for 51 years. Carys was chosen by Branwen when Branwen could no longer walk the track. How is the keeper chosen? By the keeper before her. The choosing is private. The village is not consulted. The keeper, on a particular afternoon, calls on a particular woman in the village, and the woman knows when she opens the door what is being asked of her, and the woman almost always says yes. There has been, in the records, one woman who said no. The next woman the keeper called on said yes, and the duty continued, and the woman who had said no lived a long, quiet life in the village afterwards, and was treated by the village with the same courtesy as everyone else, and was never asked about her refusal. Alwyn thought about this for a long time. Could a woman from outside the village be asked? She said at last. Megan looked at her sharply. "No," she said. "It is always a woman of the village. It has to be. The duty is the village duty. It is not a thing to be passed to outsiders. The keeper has to know the village she is keeping it for." There was a small silence. "You are not a woman of Pen Llwyd, Alwyn," Megan said gently. "You are a woman of your father's family who came up here in the summers. The village loves you. The village is glad you have come back to look after your grandmother's house. But you are not the keeper of this chapel. Do not, in the time you are here, allow yourself to think too deeply about the chapel. Do not walk up the track at dusk. Do not knock on the door. Do not, under any circumstances, ask Carys about the keeping. The keeping is hers. It has been hers for 31 years. She does not need help with it. She does not, in any way, want help with it. The most respectful thing you can do while you are in the village is to allow her to do her work in the same quiet way that the village has always allowed each successive keeper to do it." Alwyn, in the kitchen of her grandmother's house, on the evening of her 3rd day in Pen Llwyd, listened to what Megan was telling her. She understood it. She believed it. She accepted, in the careful way of a young woman who had been trained as a librarian and who knew how to receive information from older people who had been carrying that information for a long time, that what Megan was telling her was true, and that the appropriate response was to leave the matter alone. She did not, after that evening, walk up the grass track. She did not, in the remaining weeks of her stay in Pen Llwyd, knock on the door of the chapel. She did not approach Carys Wynne. She did not, in any conversation with anyone in the village, ask any further questions about the keeping. But she did, one quiet evening near the end of her stay, do something else. She walked, in the late afternoon, up to the small wooden bench at the upper end of the village's main street, which sat against the wall of the village shop, and which had a clear view of the lower end of the grass track. She sat down on the bench. She had brought with her a small flask of tea and a book to read. She intended to wait. She waited for perhaps an hour, in the long blue cool of the autumn dusk, as the light failed slowly over the high hills. She watched the small shapes of the village evening, a man crossing the bridge with a sack of feed on his shoulder, 2 children running home from the upper fields, a cat moving along the top of a stone wall, an old man closing his shop for the night. She watched the color drain from the hillside above, the pale gray of the chapel in the late afternoon going slowly to slate blue, and then to deep blue, and then to the blue that is no longer quite a color, but is almost an absence of color, the blue that the world goes to in the last full minutes before it becomes the dark. And then, at the moment when the dusk had deepened to the point where the first stars were just beginning to appear above the eastern moor, Alwyn saw the figure of Carys Wynne come down the village main street with a small canvas bag in her hand and walk past the bench where Alwyn sat. Alwyn lowered her book politely, as one does for any older woman one is passing in a small village. But Carys did not look at her, did not seem to notice her at all, and walk on past the wall above the lower fields and out onto the lower end of the grass track, and begin, in the slow, steady rhythm of a woman who had walked this same track every evening for 31 years, to climb. Alwyn watched. Carys went up the track without hurrying. She climbed past the lower fields. She entered the small wood of stunted hawthorn. She emerged on the open hillside above. She continued up the slope, smaller now in the distance, her grey shawl visible against the blue of the failing light. She reached the small flat shoulder where the chapel stood. She walked through the small enclosure. She paused at the door. For a moment, in the deep blue dusk, Alwyn saw the small figure of Carys Wynne stand at the chapel door with the iron key in her hand, very small against the pale stone of the chapel wall, with the immense empty hill rising above her and the deepening sky behind her. And Alwyn understood, with a clarity that she had not had before, exactly what kind of work Carys had been doing every evening for 31 years, and exactly how much of it had been done alone, and exactly how much would, after Carys was gone, have to be done by some other woman of the village in turn. Then Carys turned the key, the door opened. Carys went inside, the door closed behind her. Alwyn sat on the small wooden bench for a long time after the door had closed. She did not, at any point that evening, walk up the track. She did not, at any point that evening, go any closer to the chapel than the bench. She watched the dusk deepen into full dark. She watched the stars come out over the eastern moor. She watched, perhaps an hour after Carys had gone in, a single faint glow of warm candlelight appear in the small window on the eastern side of the chapel. The only window, she realized now, that the chapel had, and she watched the candlelight remain steady through the long hours of the early night. She got up at last, in the cold of the deepening evening, and walked back down the village main street to her grandmother's house, and went inside, and closed the door, and made herself a cup of tea, and sat in the small kitchen for a long time with her hands wrapped around the warm cup, and thought about Carys Wynne, alone in the chapel on the hillside, with a single candle burning, sitting beside a tomb that had been wishing to open every night for more than 1,000 years. Alwyn finished her work in the small stone house in the second week of November. She left Pen Llwyd on a cold, bright morning. She drove down the long, winding road to the lowland country. She returned to her work as a librarian. She did not, in the years that followed, talk to anyone about what Megan Edwards had told her, and she did not, in the years that followed, walk the grass track of Pen Llwyd, and she did not, in the years that followed, ever quite forget the small, steady glow of candlelight in the eastern window of the chapel on the hillside. Carys Wynne continued to walk the track. She walked it every evening for another 9 years. She walked it through the long winters of those 9 years, when the snow came down on the high hills, and the track became, in places, dangerous, and she had to take the long way round through the lower fields. She walked it through the long summers, when the dusk came late, and the air on the hill was sweet with the small flowers of the upper grass. She walked it on the evening of her 72nd birthday, which she did not mention to anyone in the village, and which the village did not mark in any way, in the careful, unmentioned manner that the village had always had with the keepers. She walked it on the evening her own daughter Mare, who was now living in the next village over with 3 small children of her own, had come to visit, and had cooked Carys a small supper, and had not, while she was at her mother's table, mentioned the keeping, and had kissed her mother on the forehead before her mother left for the chapel, and had said only, "I will see you in the morning, ma'am," and had stayed in the small house until her mother had returned at dawn, and had then gone home to her own children. She walked it, in the spring of her 77th year, with the small careful slowness of a woman whose body was beginning to tell her, in the small private language that bodies use, that the walking would not continue forever. She had begun, by then, to think about who the next keeper would be. She had thought about it for several years. She had spoken about it with no one. She had, in the careful, unhurried way of the keepers, allowed her thoughts to settle slowly, over the course of many evenings sitting on the keeper's stool in the chapel, on a single woman in the village who she had come to believe would be the right one to take up the duty after her. The woman's name was Ira Reese. She was a quiet, competent woman of 41. She had 2 children, both of whom were now grown and had left the village. Her husband had died of an illness 3 years before. She lived alone in a small house at the upper end of the village. She kept a small garden. She read, in the long evenings, books that she borrowed from the small library in the next village. She had not, in the village's awareness, ever shown any sign of any unusual interest in the chapel, but she had also never shown any sign of any unusual interest in anything else, and Carys had come to understand, over the long, quiet years of watching her, that Ira was a woman who kept her interests and her capacities very carefully to herself. Carys called on Ira on a particular afternoon in the late summer of her 77th year. She knocked on the door of the small house at the upper end of the village. Ira opened the door. Ira looked at Carys on the doorstep with the quiet, intelligent eyes she had always had. Carys looked at Ira. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "Will you come in?" Ira said quietly. Carys went in. They sat in Ira's small kitchen, which was warm and clean and contained a small fire of peat in the hearth and the smell of bread that Ira had baked that morning. Ira made tea. She set a cup in front of Carys. She sat down across from her. "I have been waiting for this visit for some years," Ira said. "Have you?" Carys said. "I have." "Why?" "Because I knew when I was a girl of 15 that I was going to be the next keeper. I do not know how I knew. I have not spoken of it to anyone. I have lived my life around the knowing. I have arranged my life so that, when the visit came, I would be ready for it. My children are grown. My husband is gone. My garden is in good order. My house is clean. I am ready." Carys looked at Ira for a long time across the small wooden table. "Then I do not need to ask the question," Carys said. "No," Ira said, "but ask it anyway. The custom requires it. I would not begin by breaking custom." Carys asked the question. Ira answered it. Carys taught Ira the duty in the months that followed, in the long, careful way that the keepers had always taught the duty to those who came after them. She showed her the walk. She showed her the door, the key, the candle, the stool, the blanket, the book, the bowl, the knife, the rosemary. She showed her the small particular ceremony of dawn at the flat stone. She showed her the things that one says, very quietly, in the chapel through the long hours of the night, that are not prayers in any way that the village church recognizes as prayers. but that are older than the church, and that the keeper says nevertheless, because they are part of the keeping. She showed her the small worn flint by the candle shelf, and how to strike it. She showed her the small leather-bound book, and the sections of it that were read on quiet nights, and the sections that were read on heavy nights, and the sections that were read on the difficult nights, and the long, very slow section that was said aloud, over and over, on the long nights, when the keeper had to kneel. She showed her also the small calfskin book at the bottom of the wooden chest in the back room of the village church. She walked Ira up to the church one cold afternoon in the early autumn of Carys's 77th year. She lifted the lid of the chest. She lifted out the documents one by one. She lifted out the calfskin book. She set it on the table in the back room. She opened it. She showed Ira the 3 entries. She read them aloud. She read aloud the line at the end of the 3rd entry. It is closer than we thought. She closed the book. She put it back in the chest. She put the documents back in their places. She closed the chest. That is what we are keeping it from, Carys said. That is what the slate is, the closeness. We do not know what is in the slate. We do not know what would come out if it opened. We know only that the closeness is real, and that the keeping holds the closeness back, and that without the keeping the closeness would come. Ira listened without speaking. She had been listening, very quietly and very carefully, to everything Carys had taught her, for several months by then. She had absorbed the teaching with the patient quality of a woman who had been preparing her whole life for it. "You will be a good keeper," Carys said. "I will try to be," Ira said. In the spring of Carys's 78th year, on a clear cold evening in early April, Carys walked up the grass track for the last time. She walked it with Ira beside her. She unlocked the door for the last time. She and Ira sat through the night together in the chapel. The night was a quiet one. The slate was almost sleeping. The candle burned steady. The wind outside was very gentle. The first grey light of dawn came in through the small eastern window, perhaps an hour before the proper hour for the keeping to end. And Carys watched the light come. And she thought, in the small, quiet way that one thinks of important things at the end of long undertakings, of all the keepers who had sat in this chapel before her, in the long line of women that ran back through the centuries to a beginning that none of the keepers knew. And she felt, very briefly, the small steady weight of her own place in that line, and the small steady weight of Ira's place in it now, and the small steady weight of all the women who would, in the centuries to come, sit on this same low stool in this same small chapel, and lay this same fresh rosemary against this same dark slate. And she was not, in any way, sad. She was, in the careful word that she would have used herself, content. The work she had done was good. The work that would continue was good. The chapel was in good hands. At dawn, Carys took the small iron key from the iron ring inside the door. She placed it in Ira's palm. She closed Ira's hand around it. "It is yours now," Carys said. "Yes," Ira said. They walked back down the track together in the soft, pale light of the early morning. At the lower end of the track, where the village began, Carys turned and embraced Ira very briefly, and then she walked alone to her own small house, and she did not, for the rest of her life, climb the grass track again. Ira walked the track that evening, and the next evening, and the evening after that. She has been walking it ever since. The chapel of Pen Llwyd still stands. The dark slate tomb on the western wall still bears the small, smooth depression worn into its upper face by the small, careful pressure of fresh rosemary every night for more than 1,000 years. The candle in the eastern window still burns through the long hours of the deep blue nights. The grass track still runs up from the lower fields, through the small wood of stunted hawthorn, out onto the open hillside above. The villagers of Pen Llwyd still do not, in any conversation, mention the keeping. The children of the village are still taught, almost from the moment they can walk on their own, that the chapel is a place that is not for them. Carys Wynne lived another 7 years after she gave the key to Ira. She died, in her own bed in the small house in the village, on a morning in the late autumn of the year, with her daughter Mare beside her. She was buried in the small graveyard behind the village church, which is a different place entirely from the chapel on the hill. and which is, in the way that ordinary graveyards are, a place where the village dead are buried with names and dates, and small inscriptions on their stones. The inscription on Carys Wynne's stone reads only her name, the dates of her birth and her death, and the words, "She did her work." Ira Reese is the keeper now. She has been the keeper for some years, and she will be the keeper by every reasonable expectation of the village for many years more. She has learned the quiet nights and the heavy nights and the difficult nights. She has not yet sat through a long night, but she knows the long night will come, and she has prepared herself for it in the small, unhurried way that the keepers have always prepared themselves. When she is no longer able to walk the track, she will choose the next keeper, in the careful private way that the keepers have always chosen each other, and the duty will continue, and the village will continue, and the tomb in the chapel on the hillside will continue. In the long, quiet way it has continued for more than 1,000 years, to be kept company through every night by one woman of Pen Llwyd, with a small fresh sprig of rosemary and a single beeswax candle, and the quiet, patient presence of someone who knows that the work she is doing is being done so that the rest of her village does not have to know that the work needs doing at all. May the keepers always come. May the rosemary always be laid. May the long, quiet work of standing watch beside the dark slate tomb on the hillside above Pen Llwyd continue, in this village and in all the other quiet places like it, for as long as there is a world that needs them. Good night.